Welcome to this interview with Charles Fadel. If you allow me, I'll start by explaining who I am and the context for this interview. My name is Régis Bémot. My background is in machine learning research and software engineering. I work at Edly, where I am Vice President of Engineering. Edly is a division of Arbisoft, which is a global provider of software products and consulting services. At Edly, we have a very, very strong focus on online education. And this interview is happening in the context of Edly Academy, which is a free online platform that we are currently putting together, where we publish data and insights on learning in general and EdTech in particular. Our guest today is Charles Fadel. Charles, you are founder and chairman of the Center for Curriculum Redesign. You are a global thought leader in education with expertise spanning from K-12 schools to higher education and lifelong learning. In addition to your responsibilities at the Center for Curriculum Redesign, you are a board member at the United States Council Foundation. More recently, you have authored a book, Education for the Age of AI, and you have authored previously other books, including 21st Century Skills, Learning for Life in Our Times. I will add that we are both French speakers, but that the rest of the conversation will be in English. Thank you again for joining us, Charles.
My pleasure, Régis. I would like to add, in terms of bio, the fact that I am an expert at the OECD, part of the AI experts team at the OECD, and wrote a book called Artificial Intelligence in Education back in 2018, when the progress in machine learning made me realize things were starting to get real before the hoopla that started in 2022. And that's due to the fact that I've been dabbling with AI since 1989, at a time when we could only compute 3 layers of artificial neurons. Now, with 1,000-layer plus, you can see how much the world changed and the massive data sets we have. And so I'm lucky to be at the right place at the right time, because there's so much hype and so much misunderstanding. People toggle between either thinking AI can do everything or nothing. And yet, in this conversation, I hope we will right size what AI can do now and in the future.
Thanks for reminding us of that. So I was in that room in 2011 when, with Yann Lequin and others, when convolutional neural networks made a big splash. It was at ICCV. And I remember the conversation in the room at the time was that, how is this different from your paper from 1989? And Yann Lequin replied, no, it's the same. It was just with more data. So today things are slightly different. But would you say that things have drastically changed in education from 2018 until now? Has AI drastically changed how education should be done? Or is it just a tool that should be used in the context of education?
Well, AI is only starting to affect how things are done in education. Obviously, some of us could jump literally on November 30, 2022. A number of us jumped, said, oh my God, the world has changed. But it takes a while for adoption in various industries. Actually, you could say that education has adopted rather rapidly, sometimes for the wrong reasons like cheating, etc. But at least it's the third largest market segment, as recognized by the AI titans out there. And so they know that it's an important industry at the same level of, let's say, healthcare or whatever else, contact centers, etc. So that's the good news. The bad news, of course, is that teachers are overwhelmed with what they have to do already on a daily basis. And here we're introducing a very disruptive tool without necessarily training them, without necessarily giving them guardrails, the students using it for the wrong reasons, et cetera, et cetera. So as much as it should be helpful, it's also providing a bit of tension and headaches. And yet at the same time, you have people who are overly enthusiastic, if not completely hype-ish, that say, oh, well, who cares about the teacher? We're going to replace those damn teachers, et cetera, et cetera. That's a terrible thing to do and say, and yet some people say it, even very prominent people. And so that's where the difficulties lie. People do not want to have a careful, cautious, intelligent conversation. It's the toggle between the Luddites on one side and the hypists on the other side. And we try to really be in the middle and just say that, okay, look, this is the logic, this is what AI can and cannot do, this is what it might be able to do in the future, etc. Be a cogent source of information.
In your experience, what have you seen in practice? Where have you seen examples in practice where AI is used to help students fulfill their real potential and help, or maybe help teachers teach better in practice, and very concrete examples?
That's not the area of education where I focus on, because there's countless companies working on the how of using AI, and there are thousands of daily examples of how you can use it properly and not properly. What I focus on is something that is really under the radar, unfortunately, which is what should you be teaching in the first place? So ignore AI for a second. Why would we be teaching so much trigonometry and so little data science or discrete and computational math in high school? Why so much algebra, right? So that's just irrespective of AI, the world is modernized, the world has changed, the requirements of the disciplines have changed, and yet the education system, which is blocked by the various baccalaureates, continue to teaching very traditional canons. Now you add AI on top of it, and you say it's not only a question of teaching more data science and less trigonometry, but it's also a question of figuring out what within data science you should be teaching that's going to be resistant to AI's encroachment. Or viewed another way, what should you be teaching that will be leveraging AI on the positive side? And so those are the questions that countries and jurisdictions are not anywhere near sufficiently addressing. Everyone's going on autopilot, basically, and any chance of changing things gets shut down by the various Abitur, Baccalaureate, Gaokao, whatever it is in a given country. And so unless these things change, we're all limited in how much we can change the what of education. Now, I also address the what of education here in the context of knowledge and the disciplines. But you can also look at reports from the World Economic Forum and others showing that it's not just what you know, it's also how you use what you know, meaning your skills. It's also how you behave and engage in the world, and that's your character. And it's also how you reflect and adapt, and that's your meta-learning. So these three extra dimensions are the ones that are, very, very important in an age of AI. They were already important before, by the way. The business world has been saying these things for 20 plus years before AI. But now AI is adding another layer of pressure saying, and these things are more important than ever. And so, again, that's another facet of what education should be about, this whole aspect of competencies. And yet it is not really being deployed by countries. What they have done to date, we have 110 plus countries, according to Brookings Institution, that have adopted in their write-ups that they should be teaching some form of skills, right? And so you have capabilities in Australia, you have socle commun in France, etc. But these efforts do not get rewarded, do not get taught to the teachers, do not get rewarded by the final exams, and so they fall on deaf ears. And so that's the situation there about these competencies. So you see, both on the content side, on the knowledge side, and on the competency side, we're nowhere near moving fast enough to where the world requires us to be in 10, 20 years. Actually, even 10 to 20 years ago.
But on the other hand, we are seeing students adapt to the new tools that generative AI provide. So in that sense, students are adapting faster than institutions, which should not come really as a surprise. I'm going to use the word disruption here because this is what's happening in the classroom. The habits of students are really being disrupted by these new tools, yet the curriculums are not really being disrupted. But this incoming disruption that should be happening, is it for the better, or is it time for our curriculums to change in the classroom?
It was time already 20, 30, 40 years ago. I mean, if you look at the problems we're facing today, they're problems related to lack of critical thinking, lack of ethics, etc. So even 40 years ago, the curriculum was already starting to get stale. The transition had to happen because the world was shifting from knowledge is sufficient to knowledge is just necessary but not sufficient. The education world completely missed out on this first wave That was due to, in great part, due to the internet. But now there's a second wave piling on top, and yet there's an overhang of things that should have been done 20, 30 years ago. And now the pressure is being added by AI. So yes, students are adapting, but they're adapting in a very, very tactical place, meaning they don't have the choice whether or not to learn trigonometric functions. They have to. And so they're doing the best. But in reality, they should be learning sine, cosine, tangent and move on and learn data science, or basically statistics and probabilities, if you want to use less sexy nomenclature, and just do that a lot more, because that's much more useful for someone's life in general.
So you used a word that I don't hear very often in the context of online learning, and that's ethics. So you mentioned that we should be teaching learning that more. Can you elaborate on that and how AI tools can help work? Help?
So certainly. So the need for ethics. I mean, just look around you. we have a certain number of sociopaths out there running things, and right, it wouldn't be a bad thing to have a better sense of civics, a better sense of ethics for the general population as well as those sociopaths. And certainly the engineering world could use a lot more of it, because as engineers, we tend to create a lot of things and worry about the consequences later. And unfortunately, the consequences get hijacked by money, by greed. So you could imagine that if we had a little bit better sense of ethics and care about the rest of humanity, we wouldn't be doing things like the excesses of social media and probably the excess of AI, which will likely come. So I'm not again talking about the AI as a tool to teach ethics. AI as a tool can teach pretty much anything. It's very much like asking whether a search engine can teach you something. Yeah, it can, sure. But it's more a question of whether, again, the environment will value that and make it a necessity rather than a nice to have if you're a philosopher, rather than a necessity for every student.
Do you have examples of institutions or countries which have successfully used those tools in the pursuit of teaching better ethics?
Again, Regis, I'm sorry, but I don't track the how part. And so, in as much as your questions are related to the how, I'm not going to be able to answer them. It's really about the what. And that's what my focus is on. And there are lots of experiments out there. The question is whether they're getting to critical mass of measurability, of truthfulness. Or you see sometimes an article saying, well, Kenya or whomever used an intelligent tutoring system and they got their improvement by, their results improved by 20%, except it's not repeatable, it's bogus data, etc. So we're going to see a lot of claims and counterclaims. And unfortunately, things are moving so fast that there's no time to do a randomized controlled trial on all these things and figure out what's hype, what's reality. Right? I mean, it could not have worked, let's say, on GPT 3.5, and now we're at O3, and perhaps it works with O3. And we just don't have the time to do these experiments. So that's why the how is a constantly moving target. And yet, paradoxically, the what is a profoundly inertial goal.
Okay, I got the message about the how and the what. Then I'd like to talk about what engineers should be learning. I'm obviously very much interested in this specific category of people, so I'm not going to ask how, but what else should the engineers be learning? And in this age where ethics matters probably more than the tools themselves.
Well, so you mentioned ethics, that's one aspect. So if you look at the curriculum for engineers, typically the first 2 years, at least in US universities, are general studies, right? And those general studies have a lot of humanities content and so on. As engineers, we look down on this saying, oh, this is fluffy stuff, we don't like it, we'll just pinch our nose and do it anyway. But in reality, that's what's going to give you the broader set of tools, the Swiss Army knife, if you will, that will help us figure out what to do next. Now, engineers, luckily for them, grow up knowing that they need to continue learning, that it doesn't stop because technology moves ahead. Particularly in computer science, it's constantly moving in some ways, because we also know that a lot of the principles go back to the 1950s and 60s, and those have not moved particularly much. But the languages are constantly changing, and now it's Python, and 2 years ago it was something else. And so that's the complexity that's constantly changing in computer science. Engineering at large definitely needs to understand ethics a lot better, but also all the other facets of an education. So critical thinking, creativity, communication, collaboration, certainly ethics, curiosity, courage, resilience, metacognition, and meta-emotion. Those are the 10 factors that we have identified in our book called Education for the Age of AI. And that's where really everyone should be. Engineers having a certain additional responsibility because they're the ones changing a lot of the world around us. So I would say lawyers on one side because they end up in positions of power, and engineers because they also end up in a different way in positions of power. Those are the two journalists perhaps as well. The categories that need to pay a lot more attention to certainly ethics in particular and other parameters. Now, there is one that's absolutely essential for humans at large, and that engineers generally do well, but it should be propagated to everybody else, which is adaptability. If you think about it, a very short definition of intelligence of humans versus AI could be, well, humans are adaptable. Evolution has made us really complicated inside our skulls so that we can adapt to all sorts of situations, and that's why we have survived so far. AI, on the other hand, is very clunky and not adaptable so far. And so the ultimate differentiator is this ability to continue adapting. And engineers do that reasonably well, and they are generally self-directed learners. Those are qualities that will serve them extremely well. These are really the uber qualities, if you want, the distillation of what they need to do. And that needs to be propagated further. Another thing I'd like to see is that the engineer's mindset be propagated further. So what I do here with my center, we call this education engineering. Education engineering, the same way there's civil, mechanical, electrical engineering. So I'm an electrical engineer, right? But I figure, well, we need really the principles and mindsets of engineering to be applied across. For example, why go straight into a production line without a prototype? That's insane. But that's how laws are passed and deployed without even testing them. Or, for example, why would you wait for data and do a feedback on the data rather than feed forward? Try to anticipate and avoid the problem in the first place, like we did with the year 2000 bug. Of course, there's no glory in it because you've avoided the problem, and then all the naysayers say, see, there was no problem to begin with. No, we just avoided the problem because we did feed forward. So these are the sorts of mindset and techniques could be added. Oh, I'm thinking another one here. Ask why 5 times. The total quality management mindset. Sure, get to the root cause. Don't just come up with a solution that's number 25 on the Pareto chart. Be serious, try to look at the top 2 or 3 effect sizes. So ask why and go to the cause and not some cosmetic thing. So here are all examples of education engineering mindsets and concepts applied to education. And imagine if everybody had those starting K through 12, then you'd have that permeate the same way that there's an understanding of history, there's an understanding of mathematics. Why isn't there an understanding of engineering? We have relegated engineering to only college or universities, but why? We talk about STEM, right? Science, technology, engineering, and math, but we only teach math and science. We don't teach technology and engineering. We don't teach the human-made world. We only teach the natural world because there's no time in the curriculum. There's no time left because the traditional disciplines have sucked up all the time. So we're back to my saying we need to revisit the disciplines, modernize the traditional ones, and add modern ones like technology and engineering.
I love how you don't focus on the tools, but focus on the core principles. I'm wondering whether these skills, these 10 skills that you listed, if they are static skills, you learn them once and for life, or you need to constantly learn them again? Or like, how does this learning have to happen just at school and in higher education, or is it a lifelong learning thing?
It's absolutely a lifelong learning things because you are what you train. And if you stop training something, you're not going to be quite so good at it. But perhaps life circumstances do not require that you still be at the top of your game. It's a little bit like, I don't know, doing martial arts or acrobatics in a plane or whatever. You're functioning at the edge of the envelope, but once you're done with your context, tense, and so on, you kind of regress, and it's okay. So imagine, visualize it as the equalizer for an amplifier. You have a bunch of dials you can turn up and down. Obviously, you want to have a minimum threshold for everything. You don't want to be a psychopath. You have to have a certain level of ethics. But not everyone's going to be a saint, right? And same for the other characteristics, whether it's courage or critical thinking. You're going to need all of them at a minimum level. And then depending on the circumstance, you're going to move them up and down, and they're going to go back down if you don't exercise them enough, etc. So it's very much like a Swiss Army knife. You're going to sharpen the blade at one point when you need to use it, but if you don't use it over time, it will become duller again. So it is a constant reshifting of our very plastic mind, or very malleable mind, into what matters the most in a given situation. Now, there's one thing that should concern us about AI is, of course, taking over some of our critical thinking and analytical capabilities. And over-reliance on AI is certainly a concern that we have all already identified. So to what extent should I suspend my thinking and just rely on it versus work with it and keep on asking it tougher and tougher questions? Obviously, the second approach is a lot better, but it presupposes that you have built that, we have scaffolded you to build that cognitive capability in the first place. If we haven't, then you're going to be accepting whatever comes. It's not particularly different from lack of critical thinking with social media. People of a certain generation which haven't exercised that care in paying attention to the source of data are more willing and more likely to accept anything and everything than people who've been trained to realize, wait a second, that's just one person's opinion, it's not gospel. I'm going to give you another example of how things can shift very, very strangely. I was part of the original work on the global system for mobiles, GSM. At the time, we had small frequency channels open between the voice channels. And at the time, everyone was thinking voice only. No one cared about data. So we figured, hey, how 15 kilohertz, what can you do with that? And people invented the small messaging system, SMS. And no one figured out at first that it was going to be that successful, but it was. And the consequence of that a few years later is that people starting canceling meetings with you without the social pressure of having to talk to you. And so all of a sudden they don't show up and they say, oh, sorry, something else has happened. Well, that has affected how people behaved. And then you add another decade and you add Twitter on top of it, and now you're affecting democracy. Right? And so these are first derivative and second derivative effects that no one could have predicted. So here we are able to see that AI could affect our rational thinking, but I'm also worried about the unknown unknowns that we're going to uncover. What exactly does it do? It maybe propagates a certain type of thinking. Perhaps it's more deductive and less inductive, or less abductive, or whatever. Is that a good thing for humans or bad thing? We don't really know up front. So that's the fascinating. We're the alpha and the beta experiment in all of this.
In a separate conversation, I would like to ask you if you have any regrets in defining the standard for SMS and GSM, but that can wait until later.
Well, luckily I was not defining them myself. I was participating in it, but it's a bit like apologizing for history itself. History is full of unintended consequences. Some turn out good, some turn out bad. I don't remember, it was a premier of China being quoted saying that it was too early to judge whether Napoleon was a good thing or a bad thing. Because, well, Napoleon did terrible things and he did actually good things too. And so what's the overall impact? Is it more positive than negative? Who knows?
Well, I live in France, and in France it's very clear he's a hero. But I'm getting that there are different opinions out there.
Yes, exactly.
So I'm guessing that your proposals on those meta skills, I would say, that we should be learning from first principles, they don't play well with the criteria to which universities and ministries of education worldwide try to abide in order to rank highest in the global ranking system of
Exactly.
education. How, and I'm asking a how question, how do you convince those places of learning to adapt to those new curriculums?
So you're asking the how question about the what, which is fine.
Yes.
It's asking the how question about the how that's not fine, since we're talking about the meta level. So in any complex system, there are okay. So there's a difference. Forgive me if I go perhaps too much into engineering. Stop me, but that's the analogies that come to my mind. So
I love
you
engineering.
have feedback. Okay, well, so you have feedback control systems with various nodes in the system, and you have truly complex systems where you have at best a phase state situation with a contour. I try to figure out if there is in the system a place where I can find nodes on which I can apply pressure. And if I apply pressure in those nodes, they unravel the system. So in education at large, the node that I have identified is the one of university entrance requirements. If you change a baccalaureate or if you change a Gaokao, etc., you literally free up K-12 to teach different things. And of course, it puts the pressure on university to accept that, you know what, the student is not going to have as much trigonometry, and you know what, it's okay. They will do more better in data science and everything else. So that's really the lock. So as to how you go and change it, it's literally identifying in every country that matters, that can serve as an example for others, who are the few people who unwittingly and unknowingly to even themselves have their finger on that change button. And that's exactly what we're doing.
And have you found countries or
Yeah,
institutions
we have, but it's too early to discuss. So stay
Okay.
tuned. In a year, I'll be happy to come back here and tell you about the progress.
Oh yeah, I love that. And so I really love how you find those like acupuncture sort of nodes where you can apply pressure.
Yeah,
And
exactly.
uh,
That's a good analogy.
yeah, in the huge body of education worldwide. So you have found one that is at the intersection between high school and higher education. Can we find similar nodes later in a learning journey?
Very good question, because there's a similar mismatch happening between higher ed and employment, right? And employers have been asking for 25 years. We need people who are already capable of critical thinking, of collaboration, etc. And higher ed has only very partially responded to that, because it's a very normal tendency to want to push on the knowledge dimension, and professors are not really trained on teaching these more subtle constructs. And so it requires them to change their teaching methods. In other words, as you are teaching me eigenvalues of matrices, you also teach me how to think critically about whether the result I get makes any sense whatsoever or not. And so that typically doesn't happen. People spend too much time on the content, very little time, if at all, on the concept, and certainly even less on the competencies. So what do I mean by concept? Take an exponential. An exponential is not just f of x equals e at the x power, or whatever formulation you like, but it's also deceiving, then explosive. That's the concept behind an exponential. That's one of the two concepts. The other one is it's self-similar, wherever you look at it. But that's a geeky thing. The really important part for humans is it's deceiving, then it's explosive. In other words, that's the so what. Now, the now what becomes, that means that we have to act on it ASAP and not let it acquire momentum, like pandemics, global warming, etc.
Or AI.
Or AI. So you see the succession of what, that's the content, the so what, that's the concept, and the now what, that's the decision making. And that's the sort of thing that's absolutely not taught at all, right? And so people are left figuring out, oh, it's an exponential. And then we spent literally trillions of dollars because we didn't teach these three words, deceiving then explosive, in math class. I mean, that's so shocking.
So I'm trying to imagine you going into a boardroom full of higher ed executives telling them, we need to change the qualifications to enter university or to enter job interviews. And I'm guessing they must be asking, okay, so how do we test people for those skills? And testing becomes much harder because it's no longer multiple choice question or responding to a problem.
Correct. Absolutely correct. And that's why my center is putting in place a test system for these competencies that is multifaceted. So it's not just one type of measure done once that gives you a rating on is Charles a good critical thinker. No, it's across 40 years of higher ed or 6 years of higher ed or whatever, across 12 years of K-12, getting a quarterly test with multiple sources of information that's eventually going to get you to that precision. It's a little bit a fuzzy area where you are. It's a little bit like a Heisenberg uncertainty principle. You're in a certain zone. There's no precise point. There's no such thing that says Charles or Regis are a 3.5 out of 5 in critical thinking today. That's ridiculous. But you can see that Charles is improving in critical thinking over 12 or 14 or 20 years because we've tracked the trajectory with a bunch of small tests. And this is where the Google approach, the Google paper approach makes sense, meaning a lot of data with low fidelity can be better than very little data with high fidelity. Because the high fidelity is illusory. So traditional psychometrics would be illusory. You're not going to do one test and say, oh, wonderful, you have a 3.4 out of whatever. That's not how it works. So if you do these longitudinal tests over time, you will be able to have a figure of merit. So you can imagine even over 40 years of college, we measure at first, we measure you all the way through, we do formative assessments to correct. We don't want you to flunk, we want you to correct. And eventually there's a summative view of where you are at. So it's going to be doable. So this is something that could start deploying in the next 2 years. This is no longer complicated. Well, it's complex, not complicated.
Let me play devil's advocate.
Sure, please do.
So this system that you're describing, where you're teaching critical thinking and evaluating people over the long run with multiple factors, what does it optimize for?
Well, it basically is trying to make sure that you have been taught at the quality level for these competencies, a certain quality, meaning we have effectively been able to teach you curiosity, critical thinking, etc., or ethics, and so on. It's a question of quality and measurability of the outcome we want for these 10 competencies.
What I'm trying to get at is that we tend to focus on KPIs that are growth, revenue, whether it's personal or the company's revenue. I'm wondering whether the disciplines that you would like to see taught more don't go against that.
The disciplines or the competencies?
If the competencies that you want to teach that don't go against a narrow focus on growth.
Yeah, I don't view that at all because they are part of growth. I mean, a human is more than just memory and memorization, right? And so this is just a more realistic view of what growth is in a human. It's not just the content, it's also the concept, it's also the competencies. That's what makes you actually very effective in your job. That's really the key issue here. Whereas if you're only, a memorizer, that doesn't make you effective in your job the least bit. And by the way, that's one reason why one of the good things about AI, it puts the spotlight on how bad our tests were. Meaning if you can pass the bar or pass medical exam with an AI, it means it was basically a memorization test, even if we masqueraded it as more than that. And so that's the good news, is that it forces humans to pay attention to where it actually is thinking. What are we actually doing, rather than going on autopilot?
So it seems clear to me in this interview that you're not a dreamer kind of person. You are really very much focused on implementing concrete changes in the present. Yet I'd like to ask you a closing question, which would be, if you had a magic wand, if you could change anything in education today, what would it be? And that's, of course, a very big if question. And I realize that might not be what you're most interested in. But
it's perfectly fine. If I had a big magic wand, I would change this Gordian knot of university entrance requirements. That opens up a lot of things. Now, if you want to ask me about the dreamer side of me, I would say I wish that whatever created the universe had invented a system that was more collaborative than competitive. That would be my big magic wand wish, because it's the competition for survival that creates so much pain everywhere. I mean, just animals killing each other and us killing them, and all of that nastiness comes from this fear for survival. If it was a lot more collaborative, it wouldn't be quite that way. So that's, if you give me truly universal and deity powers, I would invent a system that's 100% collaborative and not competitive.
Well, the socialist in me agrees. Thank you so much, Charles. That was extremely enlightening. I really enjoyed it.
My pleasure, Regis, and happy to discuss more on a personal basis whenever you want.
Yeah, I would love to. And can I take you on that book? Drop it. I can order it, I guess.